we begin week 30 of our journey through the Word. And at the beginning of this week, we get to hear Paul's defense as he speaks to an angry mob of religious Pharisees and Sadducees. And Paul gives us more insight as he speaks to them of himself and his own upbringing, as he says to them, I'm a Pharisee and the son of Pharisees. And so Paul lets us know that he comes from a line of Pharisees. And as we continue to listen to Paul, and Paul recognizes his audience, we learn very quickly that there are different schools of thought in Judaism. There's many schools of thought in Judaism today. So often, as I'm talking with different people, they have a tendency to think that all Jews think the same thing, believe the same things, do the same things. And there are as many schools of thought in Judaism as we have in Christianity. And so in Paul's day, once again, we see that there were different sects of Judaism as well as different thoughts. And so we look at the different thoughts of the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the Pharisees believed in life after death. They believed in spirit beings and angels, where the Sadducees didn't believe in any of those things. They believed this life is all there is, and when it's over, and there are no spirits. And so we see two very distinct, separate schools of thought here. And so Paul, in the wisdom of the Spirit, sees what the real issue is and uses it to his advantage. And he says, I am being tried. I am here on trial because of my belief in the resurrection from the dead. Now, he's got half of an audience out there who also believe in the resurrection of the dead. And it's amazing to see how Paul confronts them with, what will you do with the resurrection from the dead? That really would smack right in the face of Pharisees who are trying to stop him from preaching about a religious Jew who had raised from the dead. And he's basically saying, how can you reject his resurrection from the dead when you yourself believe that the Bible, that the Word of God, that Torah tells us that there will be a resurrection of the dead? And so we see what happens as a result of Paul's words and how this causes great dissension amongst the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We also see that because of now it's Jew against Jew, and they're fighting and they're arguing. And so the Roman commander, he doesn't know what's going on. Why is there all this anger? And you have to understand that one of the things about the Jewish government was they didn't want uprisings in their cities. And so this commander doesn't want this information to get back to those who are the governors of the area and governor over Judea, because now his head is on the line. And so he wants to squelch this riot as quickly as he can. And so because he doesn't know why it's happening, he's going to have Paul beaten so that Paul will tell him what's really going on and why are the Jews really so angry. And so this is when Paul, in his wisdom, says, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen. And we immediately see all those Romans, the centurions and the commander backing up saying, whoa. And when the commander says, wait a minute, I'm a Roman citizen. We paid a lot of money for this citizenship. And you'll hear Paul say, I was born Roman. I was born with a Roman citizenship. Yeah, there were five in that time. There were 5 stages, 5 levels of Roman citizenship. When we talk about he was a first-rate citizen, well, there was the first-rate citizens and the second-rate citizens and on down to the 5th-rate. And then many who were in the Roman Empire were not citizens at all. So not everyone who lived or even was born in Rome was considered a citizen. So when Paul says, I didn't pay money for my citizenship. I was born a Roman citizen. What that tells us is somewhere in Paul's lineage, in whether it was his father or his grandfather, we don't know. Someone had been given Roman citizenship for, obviously they had done something that earned them their citizenship. We don't know what that was, but we know that as a result, when Paul was born a Roman citizen because his father was a Roman citizen. And so this afforded him some special care. And so now we see that Paul is taken to Caesarea, where he is going to stand before Felix and also Festus and Agrippa, and we'll get to that in just a few moments. But he's taken to Caesarea, which is by the sea. And Caesarea by the sea was the capital of the province to the Romans, but Jerusalem was the capital to the Jews. And so he's brought to Caesarea, and when he's there, he's brought into, it says, the great auditorium. Now, behind me, you will see the great auditorium. It's, definitely in a fallen state, but at one time, this auditorium was magnificent, and we only have a portion of it. It rose much higher, and it would have been enclosed. And as Paul would begin to make his defense, the rulers that he would be making his defense to, if I can show you right here, they would have been sitting right in this area right here. This area right here is where they would have been sitting. And then Paul would have been speaking from the platform here. And if I were turned around, this is where I would be speaking to them from. And so we see that this is where Paul makes his defense to the provincial rulers. Before I even begin to talk about who these rulers are, I want to let you know that you will have available at your disposal a family tree, because as I begin to go through names and who they were related to, you might get a bit confused. So if you want to get that family tree and go over it, it will help you to understand who these people are and why this is so important. The first one that he speaks before tells us that he speaks before Felix. So who is Felix? Well, we know that Felix is now the governor of Judea. We know that before him, Pilate was the governor of Judea, but now Felix has become the governor. And it's interesting to see who this man Felix is, and it will help us also understand as Paul is brought back time and time again to talk to Felix, that there's some words that he says that causes Felix to become very frightened. But once we understand who Felix is, we will understand why those words frightened him so much. And I just want to say, in the scriptures, all they had to do back then was say, he stood before Felix, and everybody went, oh, whoa, Felix, we know who Felix is. Unfortunately, we as 21st century people don't have that same knowledge. So hopefully this will help you to understand why speaking before Felix was so important. We find that Felix, he and his brother, he had a brother named Paulus, and they had been slaves, and the slaves of Antonia. So who is Antonia? Well, Antonia is the daughter of Mark Antony and Octavia. So who was Antonia? We know who her parents were, but we need to know who her son was, because her son was the one who becomes the Emperor Claudius. And as we look at this scenario, we find that Antonia has these slaves, Paulus and Felix. And she ends up giving them their freedom. We're not told all the reasons as to why, but she gives the freedom to Paulus and Felix, and so they become freedmen. We also find that Antonia has this son, Claudius, and that as Claudius is growing up, he is a social reject. In his formative years, he didn't fit in with the aristocratic high echelon, and he was such a social reject. What a sad thought that even his mother, Antonia, had rejected him. She called him a monster. She said that if you wanted to see the definition of stupidity, just look at her son. And so it ended up that Claudia was raised more by his grandmother than his own mother. And so as a result of this rejection, Claudius found more rapport with the freedmen than he did with his own peers. And as Claudius continued to grow and come into his own, he began to be recognized for a man who did have a mind and thoughts. Just because he didn't think their way, he had been rejected, but now he's showing that he has an ability to think and think differently than them. And so Claudius began to move up in the ranks as he finally comes into his own, and he becomes the emperor Claudius. Obviously, he's going to bring his own rulers around him. Well, who were the ones that he felt most comfortable with? He felt most comfortable with the freedmen. And so we find that Claudius makes Paulus, who more than one source lets us know that Paulus was Claudius's favorite. I'm sure that there's a lot of things attached to that. And he makes him his financial secretary. And as a result, Paulus becomes very, very rich. Paulus uses his influence with the emperor, and he uses his influence to have his brother made the administrator of Samaria. And so now Felix is administrator over Samaria, and Felix, because of who he was, we are told that he was a very unscrupulous person, and he didn't think twice about using bribery or assassination to get the things that he wanted. And so eventually the governorship over all of Judea becomes vacated, and so he is appointed the governor over Judea. One of the quotes of the time about Felix's rule tells us that he was a master of cruelty and lust, who exercised the power of a king in the spirit of a slave. And so we also find that not only is Felix there to hear Paul's words, but it tells us that his wife Drusilla was also there. So who is Drusilla, the wife of Felix? This is where things can get very convoluted, very complicated. So I will do my best to try to keep it simplified, and hopefully you'll follow along. First of all, Drusilla, she was the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. So we find that she comes from a very strong line of leaders as well. And so she was the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. She was the daughter, and let me back up. And you know about Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the one who had all the babies killed when Jesus was born, and he was not a liked leader at all. And so we find then that she was the great-granddaughter of Herod the Great. She was the daughter of Herod Agrippa. Who is Herod Agrippa I? you've heard about this Herod. This Herod is the one who was the Herod in the time that Jesus was in his ministry. And when John the Baptist, you may remember when John the Baptist tells Herod that he is wrong for having his brother Philip's wife. Well, this is the Herod that had his brother Philip's wife. It's also the Herod that had John the Baptist beheaded. It's the Herod that had Peter put into prison. So we find that the apple didn't fall far from the tree as we look at Herod the Great and then look at Herod Agrippa I, who is the father of Drusilla. We know that Drusilla was Felix's second wife. Felix had met Drusilla when he came to Agrippa's court and Agrippa II, and he was enamored by Drusilla's beauty. And so he was determined, and all the sources of that time do truly say that she was absolutely drop dead gorgeous. And so he determined that he wanted to have her as a wife, but she wouldn't marry someone who wasn't a practicing Jew. And he's definitely not Jewish. And so he sends a magician to her to convince her that she should divorce her husband Azizus, who was a practicing Jew, and that she should marry him, who was a pagan. Now, Drusilla is swayed by this magician. She's also swayed by some other things. She's swayed by the problem that is between her and her sister Bernice. Bernice and Drusilla both are absolutely beautiful, and both of them are jealous of each other. And so there's this contention. And so in an effort to get away from all of that, she sees that marrying Felix will give her a greater opportunity. And so she leaves her husband Azizus and divorces him, and she marries Felix. So now you can see when it tells us that as Paul was standing before Felix and Drusilla, and it says he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come. You can see why these topics became very frightening and why Felix said, okay, that's enough. And so he has Paul taken out of the auditorium. We know that Felix's time in office was short-lived, and that while Paul is in prison, we know he's in prison in Caesarea for about 2 years. And in that 2-year period, Felix is replaced with Festus. We also know from history that by the time Festus takes over, because of Felix's underhanded ways of dealing with things, Judea is filled with unrest. There is such unrest between the Jews and the Gentiles. And so Festus is brought in to replace Felix. And the description of Festus is much different than that of Felix. He is described as a fair and a reasonable man. We see this in the way Festus deals with Paul and this situation with Paul. We know that as he's settling into his position, he's visited by King Agrippa II, and he brings along his sister Bernice. And when Festus doesn't know what to do with Paul, he says, Paul has appealed to Caesar. How can I send him to Caesar if I don't even have any charges? What am I going to say he's done wrong? And so he shares his concern with Agrippa, and King Agrippa II, and King Agrippa says, well, bring him in and I will hear the charges that are brought against him. So again, who is King Agrippa II? We know that he is the great grandson of Herod the Great, and he is the son of Agrippa I. He was appointed king over the area that his uncle Herodias Philip had once ruled. Philip is the one that when John the Baptist speaks to Herod, he says, "You have your brother Philip's wife." And so the territory that Philip ruled was the territory now that's been given to King Agrippa, who is Agrippa II. And this is the Agrippa that is now sitting to hear Paul and hear why are these charges being brought against him? And so Paul has the opportunity to give his defense to Agrippa. What an amazing defense it is. I'm sure as you read it, I pray that God transports you into that place and you can hear the words that he's speaking and understand who he is speaking to. When King Agrippa II was given this position as King Agrippa, he celebrated it by marrying off two of his three sisters, one of them being Drusilla, the other one being Mariamne, but he didn't marry off Bernice. And so it's Bernice that he brings. By this time, Bernice is not a child anymore. She is now an adult, and she has been married. She has a rival beauty to her sister Drusilla's. She's been married 3 times. The first time she was married, she was betrothed to a man named Marcus, who was the son of Alexander, and Alexander had been the head of the Jewish community in Alexandria. He was also the nephew of Philo the philosopher. So once again, we see these are the higher echelon of leaders in the Roman provinces. She was 13 years old when she was betrothed to Marcus, and they were only together for a couple of years, and he dies. And obviously he was a number of years older than she was. She's again married off to at 16 years old, she's married off to her uncle, King Agrippa I's brother. And her uncle, who's also referred to as Herod, but this Herod, because they're all from the Herodian dynasty. He was a Herod, but he was the king of Chalchi. This is a small principality that was in the Lebanon mountains. And so because she was married to her uncle, Herod, king of Chalchi, she becomes the queen of Chalchi. And he dies only a few years after she marries him. She's only 20 and she's once again widowed. But she is recognized as the queen of Chalchi, and she holds that distinction, as far as I know, for the rest of her life. After her husband, uncle, dies, Bernice's older brother, which is King Agrippa II, the one that's sitting before Paul to hear his defense. King Agrippa II was appointed king over Chalchi. So after that appointment, he moves to Chalchi, and this is when he lives with his sister, who is the queen of Chalchi. And so these two become extremely close. And there are numerous sources that say that they became very incestuous in their relationship with one another. And so we know that they began to be seen publicly together and referred to as king and queen. And as a result, even the rabbinic literature mentions her and her relationship with her brother. In an effort to try to get the spotlight off of them, Bernice feels it might be wise if she takes on a third husband so that they will see, well, she's married to him. So she marries Polemo, who is king of Cilicia, which is a good-sized province. But unfortunately, the match is short-lived, and she ends up going back to her kingdom in Chelsea. Later on, even after this time that we see Bernice here with her brother before Paul as he gives his defense, we see that her lifestyle is not changed. She has a very famous affair with Titus, or an infamous affair with Titus. You might recall that Titus is the one who brings, in 70 AD, brings the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. Before he went on that campaign, she had been his mistress, and she had every hope that when he came back from the campaign as conqueror, then she knew that he would become the Roman emperor, and her hope was that he would return to Rome and they would marry. And when he returned to Rome, she also returned to Rome, but because of the public pressure, much like in the day of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, when Julius Caesar had brought Cleopatra to Rome as his consort, we see that the pressure of Rome caused Titus to be a little smarter than Julius Caesar, because Julius Caesar didn't send Cleopatra away, and as a result, that was why he was killed on the Ides of March. And so when Titus sees the reaction to Bernice, he doesn't marry her and he sends her away. It's at the end of the time when Paul gives his defense before King Agrippa and Bernice, that Agrippa and Festus both say if he hadn't appealed to the emperor, we could have set him free. But because he's made his appeal to give his defense to the emperor in Rome, we have to send him to Rome. And so at the end of that, we see Paul's transport to Rome. I am going to give you a map that you can follow as you follow Paul's journey to Rome. And what a journey that is. Once Paul gets to Rome and he's waiting for something to happen, but nothing is happening because no one has come to press charges against him. And so while Paul is there, he calls the Jews that are in Rome together. He shares the gospel, shares with them why he's there. And they said, well, we haven't heard anything about it. And so we know that as a result of sharing the gospel, some of them believe and some of them take up issue with Paul. And Paul says to him, that's it. Paul sees that he has completed his obligation to take the message to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. And now he says, you Jews, the scriptures that have described you perfectly. You have ears, but you don't hear. You have hardened hearts. And he lets them know, I'm done. Now I'm going to take the message to the Gentiles. We know that the time that Paul spends as he is still imprisoned, still in waiting for an opportunity to give his defense, we know that he is isolated in his own quarters, his own rented quarters. And it's interesting to consider how many letters did Paul write while he was there waiting and imprisoned in Rome. And as we move along in our journey later on, we're going to find that Paul didn't waste his time, that although he was in prison, the gospel was not. And that Paul's letters that he wrote while he was in that holding tank are still letters that are benefiting the church today. As we finish up our time on the road that we've been walking in the book of Acts. Now we come to another road in our progression for progress. And that brings us to the book of Judges. At the end of the week, we have our introduction to the book of Judges. And what a sad introduction it is. We find at the very beginning, we are told about each of the tribes. We're told about Judah and Benjamin and Manasseh, Ephraim and Asher, Naphtali and Dan. And as it's enumerating each one, it says they failed their task. They failed to drive out those who were inhabitants of the territories they had been given. And they ceased to be aggressive. They ceased to trust God to drive out those that they had been told that they were to drive them out of that territory. What happened? Why did they cease to be aggressive? Well, what we find is that they found their comfort zone. They had pushed out enough of the inhabitants and found a comfortable living amongst them. And that comfort that they were in turned to compromise. And as they began to compromise and intermarry with those that were in that land, they began to find coalescence. They began to find coexistence with the ones that they should have been driving out. And that coalescence, that coexistence became corruption. As I look at our world today, I find that's very much what is happening in our world, where people are finding places of comfort, and to do that, they have to compromise their beliefs, and they begin to coexist and find reasons to coexist with the things that will bring corruption. And so they make their covenants with them, they intermarry with them, they begin to preserve their enemies' pagan altars, and as a result, eventually they begin to worship their pagan gods. As a result, we're told that this provokes God to anger, and so God quits fighting their battles. You know, so often I see people who have compromised and who are now embracing the things of the world and living lifestyles that are not biblical and pleasing to God. But so often they want God to bless them. But God cannot bless disobedience. And so we find even in our world, there are so many Christians that are living defeated Christian lives. Why? Because they've compromised their beliefs. But the beauty of the book of Judges is we are going to find that at the slightest turn of their hearts, God is ready to deliver them. And so we begin this journey with the Judges as the day approaches when God is going to raise up their king. I hope that this journey this week will bring much enlightenment of things that have happened in the past, and enlightenment of things that will give us insight as we move forward in these days of the Judges. Enjoy your journey. Enjoy this week as you walk these roads. God bless you. See you next week.